Okay, so the idea is that most of this time will be used for you in the audience to comment on what you've heard and ask questions that we didn't have time for in the previously today. But since we have two new members here at the panel, I think we should allow them to say a few words to start with, if they feel like they would like to do so. Yes. One, now I must admit that the replacement for Alan, there we go. I don't have enough details. I must ask you to present yourself, please. Could you do that?
Okay, my name is Kossmann from the University of Amsterdam. I'm an economist in Amsterdam, and we're having a group on complex systems applied to economics and financial markets in Amsterdam.
Thank you. And Jeroen, I know a bit about, but I think you're better at presenting yourself.
My name is Jeroen van den Hoven, and I'm a professor of ethics and technology at the Delft University of Technology, and specialize in ethics and IT.
Yes, and would you like to start?
Sure. Many ethical issues have been touched upon. Also, some of the questions were referring to ethical issues. We had a question about responsibility, even about wisdom. Many speakers have touched upon the very central problem of privacy when we're talking about data mining. And for me personally, FuturICT is a really fascinating project, because it fully embraces a new form of doing ethics, where we're coming from a traditional conception of ethics, which was very theoretical and was severed and separated from the technical challenges and the research and development. And now we're gradually seeing that ethical challenges and discussions about democracy and ownership and privacy and accountability are taken to where the action is, where new technology is developed, in order to make sure that our public values are ingrained and expressed and embedded in that technology at the moment when we can still make a difference. It used to be the case that political discussions, societal discussions, and ethical discussions came too late. It was too little, too late. And here we have a wonderful opportunity to kind of articulate our public values, and that could move in different directions. It's not the case that this consortium has all the answers to all the questions, and then we'll just kind of routinely implement that in the technology, in the architecture. But it's simply that we need to be aware of the fact that we now have an opportunity to articulate different conceptions for different stakeholders, for a plural community that can then see to it that these get expressed in the knowledge of a very crucial and central knowledge infrastructure in the future that will then help us to deal with the problems that were discussed in the various talks, and that healthcare, crisis management, energy, climate change. It's clear that all these issues need to be addressed. It's urgently to be addressed, and that's also a matter of responsibility for us to create the best epistemic environment or knowledge environment for those who have and take the responsibility to intervene in complex dynamic social systems to make the best of it. And it's interesting to see that, for example, the European Commission has now launched a big initiative and is exploring this idea of responsible innovation. And it's looking actively to be explicit on what responsible innovation means. So it will require of every research proposal that lands on the desks in Brussels for funding, it will try to assess it on the basis of the degree of responsibility that is taken by the researchers. Is it formulated in the proposal itself? So I think this all is present in FuturICT, and I think we're at the right time. So that's as a starter.
Thank you. Would you also like to say some words?
Well, maybe what I could add to Alan's talk is that I think in economics we are studying the effect of non-rational behavior, which is very important in the financial economic crisis, for example. Alan sketched this attitude in the standard approach to macroeconomics, where everything was assumed to be rational. But I think in the last 10 years also the economists are increasingly studying behavioral economics, behavioral models, where they study non-rational behavior in experiments, for example. And then the key issue is how this non-rational behavior affects the market as a whole, so affects the economy. I think that's a very important topic that's studied in experiments. And by studying these experiments, you can use those experimental data to build that into the economic models and do policy analysis based on behavioral models. I think that's what FuturICT is very much about. I think very important. And economics, we need these kind of models, referring to what Trichet was calling for. We need these kind of models to do good macroeconomic policy analysis.
Thank you. Yeah, then it's time for I remember there were lots of people previously who wanted to say things that we didn't have time for. Yes, I'll just start.
Frank Schweitzer, ETH Zurich. So, thanks for the wonderful talks. I think everyone emphasized one point, that's the big data. The big data is available, big data is available, big data is available, right? So this was a message. The question is, what are we going to do with the big data? I mean, for me, the big data issue is something like the Oracle of Delphi. So, I mean, we have to know first what kind of question we would like to ask to this Oracle in order to get an answer. So the question then is, how do we develop the right question in order to expect the right answers? This is question number one. I'm sure that FuturICT is addressing this issue, but I would like to hear more from the speakers what kind of solution they have in mind. The second issue that is as important is the modeling issue. I mean, Kars already mentioned this. At the end, I think that we may agree on the fact that the data is not the message. We do science and we have to understand how things work together, how one thing leads to another. That means we would like to have models of the behavior, of the dynamics of social or economic systems. And this behavior needs to be formalized and has to be also put up in a more tractable modeling way. We have heard lots of criticism today why current models didn't work, but we have heard very little of the models of the future that basically should address these kind of issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting questions. Who would like in the panel to start up? Dirk?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say that in FuturICT, we're distinguishing ourselves from sheer data mining and machine learning. It's clear to us that this has limitations and that the value lies in the combination of theory and data. So we're often talking about theoretically oriented or theoretically informed data mining. Just to give you an example, we've been working on traffic forecasting for German freeways, and all the data that were available were either inaccurate or incomplete. So either you have cross-sectional measurements, but only every so and so many hundred meters or even kilometers, or you have floating car data, but very few, and they're not representative, and the data are not mutually consistent. What we did, we combined this with conservation law that basically represents that cars are not being produced or lost on the freeway. And only this combination of the three different approaches, the two data sets plus the theoretical backbone, allowed us to come up with a good prediction that improved a lot as compared to previous approaches. This is just one example, but it illustrates somehow the general approach. I should also say that FuturICT is engaging much more into identifying important, difficult, and good questions, much more than we've done traditionally. Traditionally, we have been oriented at producing results, producing papers, But I'm deeply convinced that the biggest challenge is to identify the root questions. And we call this Hilbert questions, but you could call it in any way, in some sense. And the plan is to have regular so-called Hilbert workshops, where we would not only spend time on finding solutions, but spend more time on discussing what are the problems that we need to address, really. And we would like to have awards, a competition basically for good solutions, something that can be formalized in a crowdfunding platform that's bringing together questions with bright people with funding. And in principle, this platform could also be used by the public and by companies to pose their questions, their problems, and others would pick them up. That's the idea, to have a self-organizing platform to allow problems and people and funding to find together.
Mike?
Yeah, I sympathize very much with what you're saying, Frank, that some of the data sets that we've been involved in, which in a sense we've responded to and got hold of, really imply, if we were to build models based on them, that the models would be really rather radically different and not necessarily any better than the models that we traditionally use. So, for example, normally in transportation, you want to know where people live and where they work. Those have been for, many generations, the kind of essence of how we think about cities. Obviously, there's simplifications involved in that. But in, for example, our Oyster card data, we don't know where people live and we don't know where they work. We know where they get onto a tube or a bus, and we know where they get off. But some of these bits, and it doesn't say that we can't build certain models about how we might, how travelers might divert, where there might be some kind of obstacle or constraint. There are new models to be built along those lines. But you're absolutely right, to some extent, the data is the tail which is wagging the dog, really, in that particular context. And I think there are many data sets of that kind that are coming on stream, which are highly problematic. There's a lot of thought about, a lot of debate, anyway, I should say, about how one might use social media to extract networks, for example. So Twitter data is quite interesting because it's pretty hard to get at the network effects as far as one can say. But I went to a talk in Cambridge, UK, by somebody from HP Labs, who basically had set up all these Twitter bots, basically. So they were broadcasting all this stuff over the net, which were kind of robots, which were responding to quite intelligent Twitter feeds, basically. And she told some very interesting stories about how people in other parts of the world considered these particular tweets, as it were, to be genuine human responses in some sense. So every time the kettle boiled, for example, the kettle would send out a tweet saying, lovely day today, or something like that. And so the point I'm making really is that a lot of we've really got very few parameters on. We've got to develop a new sense of what the data means. I think I think. Then coming up against the modeling might suggest to us that we need data which we can't get and traditionally have found it hard to get, necessary for what we want to do. So there is a real dilemma, I think, in terms of the kind of data that is being spewed out in terms of, big data.
I'd just like to add shortly that I see the value in this interdisciplinary endeavor exactly in this point, that social scientists have invested much more time in thinking about the questions that we need to ask. And so we're learning a lot from this. Maybe.
And then one more, or someone in the audience who would like to add to this, or come up? Yes, please.
Is Okay. I just wanted to ask about the divide between fundamental work that you're going to do, or how you plan to divide between fundamental work and applications or recommendations for policymakers. You've been talking a lot about what to do with traffic data, for example, and how this applies to improving traffic in the city, but how does this apply for conflict or economics or the other kind of topics you've been discussing? Thank you.
So obviously, FuturICT has both parts, the fundamental research, but also application-oriented research. It's a big investment, obviously, so society wants to have a benefit of it. And the more application-oriented work will take place within the exploratories of society, of the economy, environment, and technology. So some areas in which we are practically engaged is smart cities, smart energy systems, financial architecture. These are the kind of questions that we'll put the focus on. And also, yeah, urban environment certainty is a very important issue, because more than 50% of people now are living in cities. We have to become much more sustainable. Global warming is an issue that will require technological solutions on the one hand, but on the other hand, the problem cannot be solved without people changing their behavior in a more sustainable way. So it's always this coupling, basically. And yeah, the issue is the exploratories are there to create the interfaces to the applications.
Anyone else who would like to add?
Well, for my field, as I just in the introduction already stated, it's a big challenge to move to a new conception of doing ethics, for example. That's my angle, and where we can move from public values as they are expressed in public debates by politicians, by the people in the street who talk about privacy and have a certain idea about privacy, or have a certain idea about what friendship is. You know, your kids could come home and tell you that they have 1,000 friends, and we would say, well, really? You're working apparently with a different conception of friendship than I am. So you take those concepts and you try to formulate them in terms, or operationalize them in terms of requirements with which engineers and software engineers could then work and try to translate them into. So it's moving, operationalizing, articulating values in terms of requirements which we then could be handled by engineers at an early stage. And that conception of doing ethics is new, and a couple of groups in the world are working with it, and I consider this to be, so answering your question, this would be an ideal environment to get proof of that concept, and at the same time also supply very practical solutions to problems, so that privacy and the others. Doing both.
Down there.
My name is Heidi Bluntman. I'm in the board of the Swiss Technology Assessment, and I have a very simple question. You all sounded very convinced. You made a very convincing statements. Do you see any potential for misuse, for abuse of your data? Let's say for a firm, for a company who takes your results or part of your data and do things you wouldn't like?
Yeah, I think, Dirk? This is the observation and the question, of course, with which we started. If you started to talk about big data, about individuals, or potentially about, so qualifying as personal data in the sense of the law, then your first question is this doable? Can we do this at all? So this is core to the whole idea, and therefore there's a large chunk of the research devoted to, as already was pointed out, to privacy-enhancing technologies. So this is key, not only to the project, but I think to future society. If society wants to know itself, it has to find ways to tap those data but then overcome the problem, of course, of privacy and somehow work with it. And I think the solution is in this value-sensitive design, where you, and of course the European Commission has embarked upon this project as well. It's endorsing privacy by design, value-sensitive design, big time, and I think this is the platform, and I haven't seen that in other flagships of other proposals to that extent.
I would just like to second that. I think I come from the computer science community that has a kind of tradition of doing cool things before thinking about it. And we have to live with these Facebooks and so on that are conceived as a potential thing. And that's exactly what I was trying to say in my talk, and I want to exactly second that from the technical side. This is why this is so critical for computer science, because we get a component to understand what misuse can happen and to think about it and actually get a framework for it. And that's why it has to be by design, and it has to be there from the very beginning. And that's also what makes it attractive for us.
Hans Kutscher, Swiss Academies. I think it was a little bit too much stress on the individual privacy aspect. I think that it's not just easy to have aggregate data where the privacy is protected, but aggregate data could be looked upon as a common good, where the individuals, they would not like that this aggregate data is used in a particular way. So I think you will think about this type of misuse of aggregated data also, but it's not just on the level of the individuals, but also on the level of the aggregate data.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I think this is what the Article 29 group of the European Commission and data protection regulation is looking at, because it's looking at let's say, it's revisiting the traditional notion of what personal data is. That it is usually construed as being referential, as being individual, as being a piece of information that can be somehow be attached to you or to an individual. And it's now looking at as you said, non-referential used data that are used about a person of 34 years owning a blue Ford, whoever he is, and that may be different, but in the traditional sense, this is seen as anonymized and therefore kind of free for all to use. And as you rightfully point out, that is not true, because these kind of anonymized or aggregate data are still part of doxastic or epistemic strategies to get closer to people eventually, so it could be combined at later stages and used and squeezed and manipulated in particular ways, so that in the end, individuals could suffer as a result of what has been done to the data. And that is something that you still have to think about. So you have to move to a new definition, and it's exactly as I'm trying to describe the problem now. This is exactly what FuturICT, because one way or the other, we have to tackle that problem that you raise.
Markus Zürcher, Swiss Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences. I have the impressions, maybe I'm wrong, that you're more concerned with a bit something like man-made systems, like financial architecture, traffic, city planning, artificial social systems like Facebook and so on, man-made or man-constructed. And of course they are important and they're becoming more and more important. But in a way I cannot really see how you want to tackle these real classical sociological questions. Mr. Novak raised them with citing Herbert Mead or Durkheim. I mean, all this collective mind, how people construct sense, how people change their mind, and constitution of sense, and all these things can change very rapidly, as we know if we look at former Yugoslavia, where you had a change of mind by the elites quite quickly. So this, maybe you could say, a social world which is natural in a way, or which is given. How do you tackle these things? Constitution of sense, mind, so on.
Okay, thank you for the question, because I think it really goes at the heart of FuturICT and the complexity approach. I mean, what we can do with computer simulations is that we can model the process in how meaning is created in interactions. So, for example, you know, there is a lot of already existing models that are getting, you know, increasingly sophisticated. Of, for example, you know, how public opinion emerges from individual attitudes, and actually some important work has been done here in Zurich about, you know, the social modeling, social influence, and then we can now combine. I think that the very important aspect of FuturICT is that we in social sciences now have a lot of very fragmented models. So we have a models of single phenomena. And I think that we can already deal with, you know, emergence of meaning interactions. We can deal with portraying networks of meaning. But these are isolated models. I think that what we will be able to do, and this is why, you know, such a big project is needed, that we need to integrate these models. So we have integrated model that deals with different levels of social reality. So on the one level, we know quite well, and actually, you know, some of this work has already been done, but we can, for example, model how individual semantic networks of meanings of an individual. And then we can model the structure of context of this individual. And from this we can see, you know, who will influence whom in the common construction of meaning. Then we can take the emergent construction of meaning and go back and say, okay, now this will be transmitted back to change the individuals. So we have this, so basically this is modeling the process of emergence, where on the group level, different properties, because of the structure of interactions, will arise that we have on the level of individuals. Moreover, now, we can embed this individual models within larger models operating at a higher scale, for example, societal processes, and we can model the dynamics of culture that is being created in individual interaction, and then have it, you know, and then embed layers of, let's say, political decision-making, economic processes, and so on. And I think that, you know, what we already see happening is that a lot of very nice models are already emerging, and, you know, these models are becoming increasingly social with heterogeneity of agents, and, you know, with focus of interactions rather than elements and so on. However, I think that where FuturICT is critical, I mean, that it is in integrating these models at a higher scale. Take models, you know, that exist at different levels of social reality, at different disciplines like, you know, cognitive psychology, social psychology, sociology, anthropology. I mean, you know, and find ways, you know, and for this we really need large computers to build a multi-level models that will integrate the fields. And for example, some work already is being done, for example, in integration of psychological models of this and some economical models. So I think we can see this happening, but I think a larger integrating effort is needed to kind of actually make it happen.
Yes, Lasse. Use my position as chair to ask a question myself. Several points in the slides you mentioned that, or you emphasized that one shouldn't see FuturICT as replacing, say, qualitatively oriented sociology, anthropology, etc. And related to the discussion now, one could of course imagine that, say, in your modeling efforts, that you do not only base that on data gathered from these kind of huge data collection, because many of these are fine-tuned things about how people perceive the world, how their beliefs are formed, how they value things, how they make decisions. It's probably not the best way it's probably not the best data for getting those kind of fine-grained details, but that you will get from, say, experiments, from participatory observations, whatever is deemed. So, and then that can be fed into simulation models as well, and be integrated with the large-scale data. Is that one way of say, linking these two traditions that just been discussed? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Basically answering your own question.
Okay. There were several here. Andreas.
I'm Andreas Flache from Groningen University Department of Sociology. I would like to add to this point that we just discussed, that I believe that FuturICT also offers a very important opportunity to observe very classical questions or answers to very classical questions of sociology in online behavior. So much, as we have heard, much increasingly more social behavior is moving online, can be observed electronically. Think of Durkheim's classical question of normative integration. Well, in online blogs and discussion fora on the internet, we see how norms emerge and how they change. And we can link the models that Angie was talking about to the data that we see there and tackle questions like Durkheim's classical question, in my view. And I would be interested in the view of the panel on these possibilities.
If I can add to this one more thing, I think that that a very important direction is starting from existing classical theories. And when we can formalize them in terms of computer simulations, and when we connect the new technology, the new approach with the classic data, with classic theories, then we can often see non-trivial consequences of existing theories. And it's actually happening. For example, there is this Deutsch crude law of social relationships. It turns out that, for example, that in a non-anticipated way, it can provide very interesting insights about the dynamics of conflicts. So I think that, and by formalizing the classical theories of social sciences, we can tap on the existing knowledge, and we can also find the ways to find, for example, dynamical aspects of the theories that traditionally were not formed in a dynamical way. We can find new ways to integrate theories, and we can see their applicability in the areas where they have not been applied before.
May I come back quickly to the misuse? I think on a more general level also, did you ever think or talk about that your own success could be a danger? In that if you can say how you can change minds in a big society, this can be misused to manipulate a society. I mean, that's the problem, that when you know something, you always can use it in a bad way. But did you ever think about that or discuss about that?
Well, my own talk was actually starting off with exactly this observation, that whatever we might be concerned about misuse of data, it's happening. So data are being stolen, data are being misused, or used in ways we would never agree to. There's manipulation through information systems, and that's why we say there is a need for more transparency, there is a need for more discussion, public discussion, there is a need for more participation. And that is what we are trying to trigger off. We don't expect that companies would actually take care of this discussion and the developments that are needed to protect individuals and society from misuse. It's, however, on our research agenda to address these issues. I think this is the best we can do, address these issues, discuss them publicly, involve people into this discussion, and do our best to find solutions to this, technological solutions as well as maybe legal solutions that we need to find.
When you say that you develop models out of data to information to further down, do you sometimes test these models in the past where things were a lot more simple? I mean, can you see the French Revolution emerge from the siècle des Lumières? Or can you see the Baroque emerge from the Renaissance by just applying the ideas that you have shown to us you want to apply in the future, just to things that happen, and then give us some sense of confidence in what you're doing?
So you would like to simulate history, and that's actually a good idea. So one of my favorite projects that I'd like to do is to simulate the early stages of civilization. And I have ideas how to do that, and certainly what is important from our point of view to put it to the test, either by data that can be mined or by experiments. And I was trying to indicate that shortly, that we're not restricting ourselves to developing models and simulating them, but there's a much more complicated process that basically starts from an observation that we need to understand or want to understand, a question, a puzzle. Then we try to come up with a model that would explain it in a non-trivial way. But then eventually we would try to find data in order to test the model. We've done that for traffic, we've done it for pedestrians, we're doing it for opinion formation and social norms and conflict. So then we do experiments in the lab or web experiments in order to check how well our models work. And once we've learned how well they work, usually what you need to do is to improve the model, and then the model makes certain predictions. They work maybe well in this area, but not perfect. And so based on the feedback that the experiment gives to you, you're improving the model. And you do other experiments and so on, and there's a feedback loop, which is very important for scientific progress, to have this interaction between experimental work and theoretical work that eventually leads to better and better models. And over time, you can develop confidence regarding the reliability of these kind of models, and could use them also for systems design. In the case of traffic, for example, we developed these driver assistance systems, which would also have an effect on the overall traffic flow, such as increase the capacity, but what is more important, to stabilize the traffic flow. But we're also taking into account possible feedback effects. So we were not increasing capacity everywhere because we didn't want to have an induced traffic effect and just push the boundary and have the same problem. So we're thinking about all these issues, but it requires a critical amount of manpower to address problems from all these different perspectives and make sure that not some people who do models and others who do experiment never finds together, which we have had in the past. So this is changing now.
Maybe I can add to that. Of course, we are doing the same, for example, for financial models, bubble and crash dynamic models, for example. You can test that on the current financial crisis, but also on earlier crises, even going back to the tulip bubble, for example, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And for example, one generic mechanism that you find very often is that first there is a new technology, which could be the internet technology for the dot-com bubble, or which were actually the tulip bulbs in the 17th century in the Netherlands, a new technology. People get excited about it. People get very optimistic about it. So there's trend-following behavior that creates the bubble. The bubble goes for a while and then explodes. So that's a very generic mechanism. But of course, also, you always have new elements, new features, like derivative markets is a relatively new element. The role of complex derivatives, so financial architecture, that played an important role also in the more recent financial crisis. So there are also specific problems that you have to look into more detail. So I think on the one hand, these kind of models, you have generic features that you want to understand. That's also more related to fundamental science, I think. And you have specific features and more detailed models that you want to apply to a more specific situation.
Question that, for model to be used for policy making, it needs to be empirically verified, and of course historical verification is one way of doing this. And I think the essence of FuturICT is just making connections between different types of data sets that can be used for verification models and going to simulations, that is kind of working hand in hand with data collections and, with archival data sets.
I think this is a very important question in the sense that clearly we can build models and do build models which replicate the past. But of course there is no logical sort of presupposition that they'll be able to predict the future. I mean, nobody can predict the future. I mean, within certain limited parameters, we might be able to do certain things, I think. But in some senses, a lot, I think, of what we're interested in is change which pertains to innovation, which is extremely difficult to predict. And in some sense, there's a sort of logical dilemma that a lot, I think, is based on the notion that one builds a model of the past, tries to get it right, and then makes conditional predictions about the future. What if scenarios that increasingly one sees these what if type models being used in wider contexts where and this is the participatory thing, I suppose, in which a whole variety of different stakeholders, to use a sort of jargon of how we relate this sort of science to the wider context, bring their various views to bear in some sense on the predictions. So to some extent, models are being used to inform or even to actually engage in a dialogue, to actually spur a debate about the future in some senses. And of course, in the context of, say, city planning, for example, or policy, then many stakeholders would assume that the mandate is to actually change the future and to design it rather than to actually predict it in some sense. So I think there are some very important questions, I think. I mean, this is not I don't think any of this is peculiar to FuturICT. I mean, it's rife, I think, this discussion throughout various social sciences and indeed even some physical sciences too in that context. But I think my own view is that from what I've seen of FuturICT and the proposals, that I think people are very sensitized to these sorts of issues. And the whole participatory aspect of FuturICT, I think, is very central to this notion of how we use these technologies, these models and tools, with respect to understanding and trying to alleviate problems in society.
Maybe one thing to add is that we have learned working with simulations of complex systems, and especially it is clear in the example of economy, but I think many issues, is that prediction may be not possible. So we cannot say, how things will develop, but what we can usually do, we can discover several possible scenarios. So I mean, even if prediction is not possible, I think often, what you can do, you can describe, different conditional, or obviously scenarios. When you say things can go this way, and you can sometimes describe them in quite precise way. And then you can say, I mean, what are the signs about which one are, maybe happening, or what are the conditions that will make one more likely than the other. So I think this is not all about trying, to predict, because sometimes prediction just cannot be done in a responsible way.
Well, I'd like to add, actually, that we've learned quite a bit about traffic modeling. When we started traffic modeling, we were guided just by a simple question, how does traffic break down? We came up with simple models, and we didn't stay with those models, because once we've seen data, which were difficult to gain at that time, then everything looked much more complicated. And I should admit, had we seen the data from the very beginning, we would never have even started to come up with models, because it looked hopeless. But what we learned over time, basically, is to break down complexity and understand it in terms of a composition of elementary patterns. And now we actually have a very powerful theory of traffic flow. So it's very easy to say what happens in free flow conditions, but there are many different kinds of congestion that can happen, and it very much depends on flow conditions. But not only this, it also depends on the history, namely on the size of perturbation and traffic flow. So what we know is, okay, as traffic flow increases from low flows, then eventually you enter a rush hour situation or so. We can say, what are conditions under which traffic flow becomes unstable? So that's about when the velocity drops below 80 kilometers an hour or so, then you're entering this unstable regime. And it's a matter of time when traffic breaks down. It's actually usually a single event that causes it. It could be an overtaking maneuver of 2 trucks. And so that will happen sooner or later, but when exactly it happens, we cannot tell. We can say it's a probability of so-and-so that happens within 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so. Once traffic has broken down, again, we can make very good predictions about travel times and so on and so on. So there is this combination between kind of deterministic effects and this element of randomness. And it depends on contextual settings, it depends on history as well. And we make similar observation for many other phenomena in society where there's history dependencies, but also destabilization effects. Revolutions is a very good example for that. In fact, where a society destabilizes one regime, and we have a regime shift somehow to another organization of society. And when you look, for example, at the Arabic revolutions, then you can see that there were 2 indicators that allowed you to expect that a transition would eventually happen. One was that the gross domestic product per capita was going up beyond a certain threshold, where people start to claim more rights and liberties and basically take more control over their own life. The other effect was that family size was dropping below a certain threshold. So kind of the social network was not so tense and social pressure was not so intense. There was more this individualization process that became possible through these 2 developments. So it was a matter of an event to trigger off the process, basically. And that was, if you look at data, the price of food that increased, and that triggered off somebody burning himself, and that triggered off the first revolution. So the moment at which it's being triggered off, we cannot say. But in principle, it's conceivable that a destabilization becomes measurable, can be noticed. For certain kind of transitions, there are advanced warning signs, such as critical fluctuations and so on. It takes longer for the system to restabilize once it has been driven out of equilibrium by external shocks or so. So we believe certain things can be done, but we would certainly not claim that we could forecast the future, and that's not the goal of the project. We want to understand causal interdependencies within the system that could, for example, lead to cascading effects. And for these cascading effects, there is an internal logic, in what order certain things can happen, but they don't need to happen. There's always a certain probability that it might happen. But when it happens, then we know what are the next things that could happen. So we can learn something, but we'll never build a crystal ball or something like that.
I guess I can stick in a question while waiting for the next person in the audience. I mean, of course, a project of this magnitude, particularly in the social sciences, is of course entirely unique. And there's going to be a huge amount of research coming out of it. What I was a bit unclear from the presentation is that, of course, some of it that's going to come out would come out even without FuturICT. And what is this, I say, the value added of the scale of the program as a whole? What would be impossible to do if it wasn't, if you didn't have this gigantic funding? Are they identifiable parts, or is it just?
First of all, I think really we don't have enough experts to address those challenges. We're facing many global challenges, and they require global action. It cannot be done by a single university or a single country. These problems are too complex. It requires many people, and politics will need people who understand complex systems. Same with businesses. We don't have enough of these people. Same with data mining experts. So we need to train new experts, many more people to address these issues. We are overloaded completely by the questions that we have to handle. So we need to have more manpower. But what is really also crucial about this project is that it brings together different communities that have been separated in the past. And so in the past, it was not possible to address certain kinds of questions because we couldn't put the knowledge of different fields together. In many cases, people from different disciplines did not even understand each other. They were very skeptical to talk to each other. That has changed. We have really managed to create a community of people from different disciplines who love to talk to each other. Sometimes it's head-banging, you know, with different opinions, but it's very fruitful and productive, I should say. And everybody is very excited about this new interaction and the questions that we will be able to address with this joint activity.
Maybe I can add to that. I think, of course, the EU funding will speed up things tremendously. I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing, think of the numbers that Dirk was mentioning in his talk. If you compare, I mean, in economics and finance, what we would like to do, we would like to have detailed agent-based models to predict financial system and the economy. Now, that is a big effort. If you compare, you can compare this, I think, with weather forecasting models, where weather forecasting models after the Second World War started using satellite data and started building more detailed models. And they had a big improvement in short-run weather forecasting. We would like to do the same in economics. But this is also really requires funding because the numbers that Dirk gave, we are spending, what you would spend on this project on weather forecasting, it's multiplied by 10, okay? The financial crisis cost us by a factor 100. Now, I mean, of course, we are working on this for a while, and we started, for example, also tried to get funding, for example, from the banks. We went to the banks and asked them, look, you know, we have a big science project. We want to do something about the financial crisis. Can you help us with funding? And they said, well, you know, that's a 10-year project. That's a long horizon. We are in the middle of a financial crisis, so we cannot help you. So I think this is, to make that effort, to go to big models, this project, I think, would really be great and a big jump forward.
Yeah, in principle, there are quite a number of problems that are just in front of our door. You know, we cannot just wait until eventually people come up with models. We really have to speed up. That's why we have been talking about a knowledge accelerator that is needed. This is really needed. We need to catch up with the problems.
Yeah. I think that question ties into the discussion we had, are we afraid of our success? And I think many of the things will happen nevertheless, but I think it's in everybody's interest that a lot of these things happen in exactly this context and don't happen in some weird lab somewhere else. I mean, it's exactly your question, and I wanted to tie it to that.
Yeah. Karl Knopf from the Swiss Academy of Technical Sciences. I have a slightly critical question, which you partly already answered just now, but I want to repeat it again. What is the real advantage of putting all your great ideas, and which I highly appreciate, I see the value of it, everything what you said, in one big flagship project? There are circumstances where it is obvious. When Kennedy said, we want to go put man on the moon, it was to everybody, it was clear this can only be done in a big, large project, will take a certain time, and then it's done. Now, I don't see what, after 10 years, you have done. I mean, is this, it's not such a clear answer, I guess, you can give to me. Maybe it's not necessary. Or put the question in other words, if EU would just decide to give this topic a high priority, it would increase all funding channels which are already available in the traditional form. Couldn't you do the same thing?
I actually don't think it would happen, because traditionally, in particular in the social sciences, people have been working largely for themselves or small teams, while FuturICT has really brought people together to work in bigger teams about more challenging questions. And basically, the questions that have been addressed in the past were limited by the potential that a small group of people had. And you cannot answer really difficult questions if you work with 2 other people and then write a paper after 2 years or whatsoever. So that basically determines the size of the project problems addressed. Now, let's have a look at other areas, like CERN, for example, or the Human Genome Project or so. There are much bigger teams of scientists working on problems. And it's maybe for the first time that we have written position papers in the context of FuturICT, where there are 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 authors on one paper. So that shows you that something is happening over here, which hasn't happened before. So the interaction, this platform for exchange, this is really crucial. And it's certainly a different issue to put the man on the moon. It was an even much bigger project than this. I mean, CERN is 10 times bigger, Human Genome Project is 10 times bigger, the ITER fusion reaction is 10 times bigger, and so on. Apollo was at least 25 times bigger. And there was no companies competing with Apollo project because it was just too big. We are in a situation that we have to talk openly about our project, and it takes 3 years until we see the first research money, while companies who are listening to us and representatives from other countries who are also following this project very closely can basically invest at this moment and already work on those ideas. So we're pretty sure that many of the things that we envisage will happen within the 10 years, in particular considering that just 5 years ago, we didn't use Twitter, we didn't have an iPhone, there was no Facebook. Now we're talking about Twitter revolution, so it's just unimaginable how fast is this area developing. So it's very important to have a flexible strategy that can adapt to the situation. And I think what makes this project long-lasting is that it builds on this open platform strategy. So it serves as this communication platform to bring different communities together, to bring science and politics together, science and business together, Europe together with the United States and Asia and Australia, and so on. So that's only possible if you have a chunk of money.
Anyone else? Yes? No, you? Yeah.
My name is Michael Mees, and I'm a sociologist. And I learned a lot. You mentioned several times today that you want to integrate the social sciences with complexity science and other fields. And I couldn't agree more, because in a way, I'm a fan of FuturICT, but I also have the feeling that if you do not integrate the social scientists, then there's a high probability that it will fail, because the wrong questions are answered, It's not related to the theories that we already have. It's not related to the empirical research that we already have. So I have a practical question. How do you want to integrate us? How do you want to integrate me in FuturICT?
Yeah, I should maybe say that in the competition for the flagship pilots, there were 21 projects, and several of them were addressing social issues from an ICT perspective. But I believe we were probably the only one that really had this integrated approach. While there were a number of other projects where computer scientists were trying to address societal issues, without social scientists and complexity scientists on board. So we have invested from the very beginning into the identification of those people in the social sciences who were interested in this engagement and interaction. And over time, more people have actually contacted us. We had this open platform where people could subscribe as a supporter. Everybody could do that. We have a very open approach in terms of communication. And many of the events that we have are like this one, actually. Invite everybody who is interested to interact with us. Now, we are currently in the process, of course, to identify the core institutions and the core people. This is a difficult process, actually, as there are many more supporters than we can give money to in the first stage of this project. But we're doing that in a very differentiated way, taking into account scientific indices, but also, of course, the knowledge of experts in that field. So it's very important for us that social scientists, economists, complexity scientists, and ICT people are involved in all the work packages and that have a word to say. So from the very beginning, we're trying to have in each country, of course, we have FuturICT communities in many countries, to have a joint leadership of social scientists with an ICT expert and complexity scientists. And we try to do a similar thing for the work packages.
Maybe I would like to turn the question a little bit around. Maybe the way I see FuturICT is like a flagship, like a lighthouse. It gives direction to researchers. And so that's why I would like to turn it around. It's not the question of FuturICT to ask, how do I integrate social scientists? The question that FuturICT needs to ask is, how do I set a lighthouse that social scientists like you will follow? And then the question that you have to ask yourself is how to integrate yourself. And I think this is how I would say it from the ICT perspective. The way I see FuturICT is, how do I integrate myself? I don't go to FuturICT and say, oh, integrate me, because I don't think this would work, and I don't think it would be healthy.
Perhaps that's a good note to end on. We're already behind schedule, and we have aperitifs waiting outside. But on the agenda, there's also some that I should wrap it all up, but it's not going to be me wrapping it all up. But I have scribbled some notes, and I don't know if they're going to make sense or not, but at least I could try. And first, I guess I should say, I mean, when I accepted to be moderator of this day, although I liked and admired certain aspects of FuturICT, I was a bit skeptical to the program as a whole. I mean, it seemed like this gigantic program that well, I thought it was a bit unclear. But I must say, after now in preparation for the meeting, having been had to read lots of documents that I hadn't read before, I must say I come out with a very, very favorable view of it all. I mean, it's a vision in some ways of the social sciences that I have, in terms of scale, I have never run into before. I mean, and of course, if this program can be carried out, I mean, it's going to have a major impact on the way people do social science. And I think now it's partly repeating what just was said. I mean, I think what impresses me most is this, I mean, really integrated interdisciplinary work. I mean, where people really work over disciplinary boundaries with social scientists, computer scientists, and complexity scientists. And I think it really can work because they have a set of issues that tie them all together. I mean, it's very much a focus on interactions and networks, a focus on huge data collections, a focus on using simulations to make projections, to better understand, say, macro level outcomes that lots of interacting individuals bring about, perhaps entirely unintentionally. And I think they all fit so well together that I'm sure that it's not going to be a group of computer scientists working on their own with their specific tasks and the social scientists by themselves. But I really have the sense that the project is such that it really can bring all this to fruit. And in some ways, of the non-social scientists, I guess it must in some ways seem a bit surprising. I mean that interactions and networks and so are important. I mean, that doesn't seem to be such a groundbreaking idea in some ways. I would have thought that people would have said these things before. But I think that there are lots of reasons perhaps why that hasn't been. One, I mean, that we haven't had data before. So to the extent that people have studied networks, it has been on very small groups and very particularistic groups. One could never know whether these results could be generated to larger populations. Very much often a cross-sectional collection. At one point in time, you cannot say anything about the dynamics, both of the networks themselves, but also on the dynamics that play out on these networks. So I think that's one important impetus. And in some ways, perhaps also because of that, some kind of disciplinary path dependence, because these ideas of networks were never at the core of our disciplines when they were founded. And I think that continues to shape the way we have been doing science, that it's not now, until now, we start to see a bit of it. And also I think perhaps we didn't fully recognize how important networks and interactions can be. I mean that we have studied all too much, say, properties of individuals, the details of what they're doing without, and not fully recognizing the importance of networks. And I think that's perhaps where complexity science has meant most for social science in bringing those insights to the table and fully convincing us. And I think then that and of course, I mean, the strength of FuturICT is that it breaks with all this. It's fully interdisciplinary. It really goes for big data. It looks very much on networks and the dynamic of networks and the dynamics that networked systems can bring about. And I think it will be done on a scale that I mean, it's going to allow us, the social sciences, at least to catch up a lot, many of the years that we have lost by not considering these issues. The scale of the project will allow us to hopefully to take giant leaps forward, and I think that's something that I see as the great promise of FuturICT. And of course, I mean, some of you also have pointed out the FuturICT also includes other aspects like this with participatory. Social participation and so, which I mean is a little bit beside my areas of competence and interest. But I think even if I disregard those aspects, I think, say, the more purely scientific aspects of the program, and say, fully convinces me at least about the project. Of course, it's a high-risk project, but I think all potentially really high-impact programs also by their nature are high risk. And I think the combination of these really important questions, I mean, several extremely qualified researchers, and then of course the support of this magnitude, I think it's risky, but it's not too risky. So it's yeah, reading all the documents. I mean, I came out of this as most of the question marks were straightened out, and although there are still question marks, because I mean, I presume a project of this scale, you bring lots of qualified and talented and productive people together, and of course part of that is also that there's going to be dynamic within the project that generates new questions. So in some ways, not everything is on print right now, but in some ways that's part of the dynamic. We don't know all the questions. If we knew exactly how all this should be done, we shouldn't invest all this money in it at the moment. So I enjoyed reading the papers. I enjoyed the day here, and to conclude it all, I just want to thank the people who organized it, the people behind FuturICT for and the Academy of the Swiss Academy of Science, not the least. So I suggest that we are not part of it. We should clap those who, give an applaud to those who are.